Hey, welcome. Tonight we begin somewhere very quiet. Not on a battlefield. Not in a crowded Senate chamber filled with restless voices. But in a city that never truly slept, even when it seemed to rest. So wherever you're listening from, your bed, a couch, or the back seat of a car, allow yourself to settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow, just a little. The day doesn't need you anymore. You can leave it behind for now. And if this quiet journey helps you rest tonight, you're welcome to like and subscribe, and gently share in the comments where you're listening from, and what time the night has reached for you. Now, without rushing, let's drift back in time. Rome, at the end of the Roman Republic, was tired. Not end of a long day tired, more like we've been arguing about power for generations and no one remembers why anymore tired. By the time Julius Caesar was born, Rome had already conquered half the Mediterranean, and yet somehow still managed to feel deeply insecure about it. Which, honestly, tracks. Empires tend to get jumpy when they grow too fast. The streets were loud during the day, vendors shouting, senators posturing, lawyers arguing in public like it was a sport. But at night, Rome softened. Lamps flickered, footsteps echoed, and somewhere in that city, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar was growing up in a family that was complicated. Not poor, not powerful, just awkwardly in between, which is never a comfortable place to be. The Julii family liked to remind everyone, constantly, that they were descended from Venus herself. Yes, that Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and extremely inconvenient expectations. Of course, they mentioned this lineage whenever possible, because if you can't prove your power in the present, you might as well borrow it from mythology. In practice, though, the family's political influence had faded. They had the name, the history, the ancestral masks hanging in the atrium, but not the real leverage. And in Rome, that mattered. Young Caesar grew up watching men with less impressive names command far more attention. That kind of thing leaves a mark, quietly, slowly, like water shaping stone. His father wasn't particularly remarkable, which, in Roman terms, meant he wasn't loudly embarrassing either. A safe man, a respectable man, the sort who followed the rules and stayed in his lane. Caesar would not inherit that personality. His mother, Aurelia, on the other hand, was sharp, focused, socially alert, the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Roman historians later tried to downplay her influence, because of course they did, but she shaped him more than anyone else. Aurelia raised her son with discipline, but also with ambition that didn't shout. It whispered, repeated itself, reminded him daily that Rome was not run by the loudest men, but the ones who waited. Caesar learned early how to observe. Who bowed to who spoke first, who pretended not to notice an insult, and who remembered it forever. Rome rewarded memory. As a teenager, Caesar was already navigating danger, though it didn't look dramatic. The real threats in Rome didn't come with warning music. They came disguised as political shifts. One moment, a family connection was useful. The next, it was deadly. Caesar's aunt was married to Gaius Marius, a man who had once been wildly powerful and then very much wasn't. Marius had challenged the old elite, disrupted the balance, and paid for it when his rival Sulla took control. And when Sulla took control, he didn't just win, he cleaned house. Sulla made lists, literal lists, names of people who were no longer welcome in Rome, or, more accurately, no longer welcome among the living. Their property was seized, their reputations erased, their families encouraged to forget them. Young Caesar, barely an adult, suddenly found himself associated with the wrong people. Worse, he had married into that same political camp. Sulla noticed, and Sulla did not appreciate being ignored. Caesar was ordered to divorce his wife. Simple request, efficient, very Roman. Caesar said no, which is an interesting choice considering the circumstances. This wasn't a romantic stand, despite what later storytellers liked to imply. This was about identity, about control, about whether a powerful man could reach into Caesar's life and rearrange it at will. Caesar refused to be rearranged. Sulla responded by stripping him of his priesthood, his inheritance, and his legal protections. And just like that, Caesar went from mildly privileged to officially expendable. So he did what any sensible young Roman would do when the political temperature spiked. He disappeared for a while. Caesar lived quietly, moving between safe houses, staying with friends who didn't ask too many questions. He grew thin, he grew careful. He learned what it felt like to be hunted, not dramatically, but bureaucratically. Eventually, friends intervened, influential friends, the kind who could whisper in the right ears. Sulla relented, but not without a warning. He reportedly said that in Caesar there were many Mariuses, which was Roman for "this one is trouble later." Caesar was allowed to return, but the lesson stuck. Power, he learned, was temporary. Protection was conditional, and Rome did not forgive potential rivals. So Caesar left again, this time officially. Military service, a respectable excuse. He went east, away from the city that had nearly swallowed him. Out there, in the wider Roman world, Caesar began to test himself. Not as a commander yet, not as a leader, just as a young man watching how authority worked when it wasn't wrapped in familiar traditions. He saw provincial governors behave like kings. He saw soldiers more loyal to pay than to ideals. He saw how Rome looked from the outside, less glorious, more extractive. And he took notes. There's a story, possibly true, possibly improved with retelling, about Caesar being captured by pirates during this time. And whether or not every detail is accurate, what matters is how people remembered his behavior. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He treated his captors like mildly inconvenient hosts. He even corrected them when they underestimated his ransom value, because of course he did. That calm confidence, bordering on audacity, wasn't accidental. It was practiced, developed, polished in moments when he had nothing else. When Caesar eventually returned to Rome, he wasn't famous, he wasn't powerful, but he was no longer invisible. Rome had changed a little, and so had he. He began studying rhetoric, because in Rome, words were weapons, and Caesar wanted to be armed. He trained his voice, his posture, his timing. He learned when to pause, when to let silence do the work. He also learned restraint, which might surprise people given his later reputation, but young Caesar knew better than to rush. He began his political career the slow way, the Roman way: minor offices, public service, showing up, being seen. He spent money he didn't have on public spectacles, which sounds irresponsible, and absolutely was, but it made him visible, familiar, liked. Rome forgives debt if you're entertaining enough. Behind the scenes, though, Caesar's life was less polished. He owed enormous sums. He relied on patrons. He smiled through obligations that came with invisible strings. And yet, he never looked rushed. Even as rivals mocked his appearance, his grooming, his voice, Rome loved mocking men who didn't fit its rigid idea of masculinity. Caesar ignored it, or pretended to. He knew something they didn't. Rome was changing again. The old republic, balanced, cautious, obsessed with precedent, was cracking under its own weight. Power was pooling. Loyalty was shifting away from institutions and towards individuals. Men with armies mattered more than men with speeches. Caesar wasn't there yet, not even close, but he could feel the current.
And, quietly, patiently, he positioned himself where that current would eventually carry him forward. Not with force, not with shouting, but with timing. As Rome settled into another uneasy night, lamps dimming across the city, Caesar was already planning his next step. Not the final one, not even the important one, just the next. And sometimes, that's all history really is.
Rome didn't wake up suddenly. It sort of stretched, yawned, complained about its joints, and then went right back to arguing with itself. And Julius Caesar was very good at waking up with it, matching its mood, its pace, its irritations. By now, he was visible, not powerful, not safe, but noticed. Which, in Rome, was the first real step. Caesar had learned something essential early on. Rome didn't reward virtue nearly as much as it rewarded familiarity. People trusted what they saw often, so he made sure he was seen. In courts, in public gatherings, at festivals, in places where people remembered faces, not resumes. He spoke well, smoothly, clearly, without the aggressive chest-thumping that some Roman speakers favored. He didn't sound like he was trying to win a shouting contest. He sounded reasonable, thoughtful, like someone you could listen to without feeling exhausted. And after years of exhaustion, Rome found that refreshing. But all of this visibility came at a cost. Actually, many costs. Caesar was spending money as if debt were a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent lifestyle. He funded public games, renovations, celebrations. He paid for popularity the way others paid for armies. Because at this stage, popularity was his army. Behind the scenes, creditors hovered, quietly, politely, intensely. Caesar owed more than most men could imagine, and yet he moved through the city with the calm of someone who fully intended to outlive his debts. Which, to be fair, he did. This was not recklessness, not really. It was calculation wrapped in confidence. Caesar believed that future power would cancel present obligation, and Rome, oddly enough, tended to agree with that logic. If you looked successful, people assumed you would be. So Caesar leaned into the image. He dressed carefully, he maintained his appearance, he paid attention to small details that others dismissed as vanity. In Rome, looking controlled meant being controlled. Even his critics noticed, though they pretended not to care, because pretending not to care was a Roman specialty. Some mocked him for it, quietly of course. Loud mockery implied insecurity. Caesar let them talk. While they were busy commenting on his hair and clothing, he was building alliances. Not friendships, alliances. There's a difference. He supported causes that made the elite uncomfortable and the common people hopeful. He spoke about reform without sounding revolutionary. He positioned himself as a bridge between old power and new expectations. Rome loved bridges, especially when it felt stuck on one side of history. One of Caesar's most important early moves was aligning himself with the populares, the political faction that claimed to represent the people. This wasn't idealism, it was arithmetic. The Senate was crowded with competitors, the streets were crowded with voters. Caesar chose the crowd. He took on legal cases that challenged corrupt officials, he defended unpopular figures. He did it calmly, professionally, without making it personal. Which made it very personal. Each speech expanded his reach, each appearance reinforced the idea that Caesar was someone to watch, someone who wasn't afraid to step into uncomfortable spaces. Rome respected courage, even when it pretended to dislike disruption. And then there was his personal life, because history is rarely neat, and Caesar's was especially untidy. He married, divorced, married again, each union strategic, each separation quietly managed. Roman marriages at the elite level were less about affection and more about alignment. Caesar treated them accordingly. But rumors followed him, they always did. Whispers about relationships, about boundaries, about behavior that didn't quite fit Rome's rigid expectations. His enemies delighted in this, his supporters ignored it. Caesar himself seemed unconcerned. He understood something important. Scandal fades, visibility lasts. As long as he wasn't boring, Rome would keep watching. Eventually, Caesar secured a significant role, governor of Spain. Not the glamorous kind of assignment, but a useful one.
Spain was distant enough to offer autonomy and profitable enough to offer opportunity. Out there, away from Rome's constant scrutiny, Caesar did something subtle. He governed. Not dramatically, not cruelly, efficiently. He resolved disputes, collected revenues, paid debts. Yes, paid debts. For the first time in a long while, his financial situation stabilized. And more importantly, he tasted command. Authority without constant interference changes a person. Caesar discovered that he enjoyed making decisions and being obeyed. He wasn't harsh, he wasn't indulgent, he was effective, which is often more unsettling than either. There's a quiet moment historians like to mention from this period. Caesar, visiting a small provincial town, supposedly remarked that he would rather be first in a village than second in Rome. It sounds like arrogance. It was actually clarity. He didn't want proximity to power, he wanted possession of it. When Caesar returned to Rome, he returned transformed. Not visibly, internally. He had managed territory, balanced budgets, exercised authority without losing control. And now he knew what he needed next: scale. Rome, meanwhile, was unraveling again. Political alliances shifted daily. Rivalries hardened. Two men dominated the scene: Pompey, the celebrated general with real military glory, and Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, whose fortune made him impossible to ignore. They distrusted each other, naturally. Caesar saw opportunity. Instead of choosing sides, he did something very Roman and very clever. He united them, not through friendship, but through mutual benefit. This informal alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, wasn't a government body, it was an understanding. A quiet agreement that power would be shared, not fought over. Pompey got land for his veterans. Crassus got financial policies that favored his interests. Caesar got a path forward. Specifically, a major military command, Gaul, which at the time was less a place and more a concept, a broad region filled with tribes, forests, rivers, and just enough instability to justify Roman intervention. For Caesar, it was perfect. A long-term command, distance from Rome's constant political chaos, and the chance to build loyalty, not through speeches, but through shared experience. As he prepared to leave, Rome buzzed with speculation. Some saw him as a rising star, others as an overextended gambler. Most didn't realize what this command would mean. Caesar himself didn't make grand pronouncements. He didn't need to. He had learned patience early, learned how to wait while others underestimated him, learned how to move forward without drawing attention too soon. And now, as he stepped away from Rome once more, he carried with him something far more valuable than ambition: momentum. Gaul waited. Rome watched. And the quiet rise continued.
Gaul didn't announce itself. It unfolded. Miles of it. Forests that swallowed sound, rivers that moved like thoughts you couldn't quite finish, villages that watched quietly as Roman columns passed by, counting helmets, counting steps, deciding nothing out loud. For Caesar, this was ideal. No Senate interruptions, no daily performances, just distance, time, and the slow work of command. He arrived not as a legend, but as a governor with a mandate and a calendar. And while Rome imagined conquest in bold strokes, Caesar approached Gaul the way he approached everything else: methodically, patiently, and with an eye for narrative. Because Caesar understood something crucial: wars are remembered the way they're told. He kept records, careful ones, not just of movements and logistics, but of moments. Decisions framed as necessity, delays framed as restraint, progress framed as order. And at night, when the camps quieted, when fires burned low and voices softened, Caesar observed his soldiers. He learned names, not all of them, of course, but enough. Enough to make loyalty feel personal. Enough to make men feel seen. That matters more than speeches. The Roman army wasn't just a machine, it was a community, a moving city with rules, routines, and grudges. Caesar didn't disrupt that. He respected it, improved it, paid attention. He marched with them, ate what they ate, slept nearby. Not theatrically, just consistently. Consistency builds trust. The campaigns themselves stretched on season after season. Movement, negotiation, waiting, advancement, retreat, repeat. It wasn't constant action, it was endurance. Caesar excelled at endurance. He learned how to let tension build without forcing resolution, how to pause, how to let others make mistakes while he remained still. He learned that the threat of motion could be as effective as motion itself. Meanwhile, back in Rome, his name began to circulate differently. Reports arrived, carefully worded. Successes framed as stabilization, stability framed as peace, peace framed as progress. Caesar's enemies read these reports with narrowed eyes. His allies smiled. The public absorbed the idea that something important was happening far away and that Caesar was at the center of it. Distance made him larger. Time made him mythic. He wrote letters. He sent updates. He never sounded rushed, never defensive, just inevitable. And Gaul kept unfolding. Years passed like this. Roads lengthened. Camps became familiar. Caesar aged into command. The sharp ambition of youth softened into something heavier, more deliberate. There's a quiet loneliness to long command. Caesar felt it. He was surrounded by people constantly, yet increasingly alone in decision-making. Authority does that. It separates. At night, when the camp slept, he walked, thought, planned. Not just campaigns, but futures. He knew Rome was watching more closely now, knew that success created suspicion, knew that power, once accumulated, demanded explanation. And explanations in Rome were never neutral. Still, he continued. He crossed rivers not dramatically, but decisively. He built bridges not just of wood, but of reputation. Each season reinforced the idea that Caesar didn't rush and didn't fail. The soldiers trusted him because he didn't waste them. The local leaders respected him because he listened before deciding. Even those who resisted him understood that resistance was being carefully recorded. And through it all, Caesar remained controlled. Not loud, not cruel, not indulgent, controlled. That control became his signature. Back in Rome, alliances strained. Pompey grew uneasy. Crassus grew restless. Power doesn't like sharing space for long. The informal balance that had lifted Caesar began to wobble. News from Gaul now arrived with weight. Too much success was dangerous. Too much loyalty was threatening. Too much distance was suspicious. Caesar knew this, of course he did, but he also knew something else. He knew that when the time came to return to Rome, he wouldn't be returning as a petitioner. He would be returning as a presence, and that changes the conversation. As another quiet night settled over the camps, with stars overhead and sentries pacing familiar routes, Caesar reviewed reports by firelight. Not anxious, not hurried, just attentive. The rise was no longer quiet, but the fall was still far away.
By the time Caesar turned back toward Italy, Rome was no longer pretending. The letters had changed tone. The requests had sharpened. The politeness had thinned. Power, after all, gets nervous when it feels watched. For years, Caesar had been useful at a distance, productive, conveniently far away. But distance works both ways. While Rome debated, Caesar consolidated. While senators argued over procedure, Caesar became habit, his name, his reports, his quiet authority. Now the distance felt dangerous. Rome wanted him home.
but not that kind of home. They wanted him disarmed, reduced, returned as a private citizen who could be questioned, delayed, maybe quietly dismantled. The Senate spoke in formal language, of course, respectful, legal, very Roman. But Caesar heard the meaning underneath. Come back without protection, or don't come back at all. This is where history often adds drama, stormy speeches, raised voices, men pounding tables. That's not how it happened. Caesar didn't shout, he didn't rush, he didn't storm toward destiny like it owed him something. He waited, he read, he listened, he considered the math. If he gave up command, he became vulnerable. If he stayed away, he looked guilty. If he delayed too long, others would decide for him. Rome had placed him in a familiar position. No safe choices, only revealing ones. There's something very human about that moment, when all the options are bad and you're forced to choose the one you can live with. Caesar understood that clarity doesn't arrive with certainty, it arrives with acceptance. So he moved, not with an army at first, just with intention. He traveled south, slowly. The road narrowed, the conversations quieted. News moved faster than he did. Everyone knew where he was headed. The Rubicon was not impressive, not wide, not dramatic, just a boundary, a legal line that existed mostly in people's heads. But Rome was built on lines like that, symbolic, invisible, absolute. Crossing it with an army meant something very specific. It meant there was no going back. Caesar reached the river at night. That part matters. Darkness removes the audience. No speeches, no applause, just water moving softly, indifferent to politics. He paused, not because he was afraid, but because he understood the weight of the moment. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits to see if you're paying attention. Caesar stood there, quiet, considering what would follow, not just for Rome, but for himself, for the man he had been and the one he was becoming. And then he crossed. No fanfare, no immediate chaos, just a decision settling into reality. By morning, the news spread. Caesar was coming. Rome reacted the way it always did when confronted with the unexpected, poorly. Some fled, some panicked, some pretended they had always supported him. Pompey, suddenly unsure of his position, chose distance over confrontation. The city emptied of certainty almost overnight. Caesar moved carefully, calmly. He didn't rush into Rome. He let the idea of his arrival do the work. Cities opened their gates. Officials stepped aside. Resistance dissolved before it fully formed. This wasn't conquest, it was momentum. Caesar spoke reassuringly. He emphasized stability, order, continuity. He presented himself not as a disruptor, but as a necessary correction. Rome wanted peace. Caesar promised it, quietly. By the time he entered the city, there was less fear than confusion. The institutions still stood, the rituals continued, but the center of gravity had shifted. Power was no longer where it had been. Caesar behaved carefully, respectfully, almost gently. He did not humiliate opponents. He didn't indulge in spectacle. He understood that Rome was watching closely, deciding what kind of ruler he might be. He gave them no easy answers. Instead, he governed. He addressed debts, reorganized administration, stabilized supply lines. He acted like someone who intended to stay, not like someone passing through. And slowly, Rome adjusted. People do that, even to change they once feared. At night, Caesar slept little. Authority has that effect. There's always one more decision waiting, one more consequence unfolding, one more message arriving too late to be ignored. He walked the city, listened to it, felt its rhythms shift. He had crossed a river, yes, but what he had really crossed was a threshold, from participant to center, from ambitious to unavoidable. And as Rome settled uneasily into this new arrangement, one truth became clear, even if no one said it out loud. The quiet rise was over. Something heavier,
had begun.
Rome didn't explode. Not immediately. It shuffled, it muttered, it waited. And Julius Caesar learned something very early in this new phase. The hardest battles aren't fought with soldiers, but with attention. The Senate still existed, or at least it pretended to. Men with togas more worn than their reputations convened in the Curia, speaking carefully about laws and procedures while wondering how to survive politically. Caesar listened, carefully, patiently, because the loudest voices often had the least influence, and he was never the loudest, not yet. He had crossed a river, gained momentum, and now he needed to understand the machinery of Rome without getting caught in it, which naturally meant diplomacy. Soft, subtle, slightly sarcastic diplomacy. The kind that feels casual, almost dismissive, but moves everything exactly where it needs to go. Caesar's enemies noticed this, of course. They whispered, they complained, they wrote letters. They tried to remind the city of its traditions, but Rome had already started to tilt, and subtlety works well when no one expects it. He began addressing the streets, too, not with speeches, not with proclamations, but with actions that mattered in everyday life. Grain distributions, games, and festivals that were carefully timed to calm the restless city. Rome responds to attention more than words, he knew, and he was never stingy with it. At the same time, Caesar watched the elite carefully. Pompey and Crassus were still around, still influential, still unpredictable. He didn't confront them openly. He didn't need to. Instead, he allowed minor disagreements to surface, quietly observing who reacted first, who panicked, who underestimated him. Because that's how power works. You don't always need to act. Sometimes you just need to exist and let others reveal themselves. And then there were the ordinary Romans, citizens in the marketplace, workers along the aqueducts, and children playing in the streets. Caesar learned to notice them, not condescendingly, but intentionally. A smile here, a small favor there. Visibility is more than presence, it's subtle influence. A citizen who feels seen is a citizen who will remember. Through all of this, he maintained his personal rituals, letters, notes, observations, small acts of reflection that kept him grounded while chaos swirled around him. The city was awake, impatient, hungry for change, and yet he moved like a man who had all the time in the world. There were moments of tension, of course, minor uprisings, political maneuvering, accusations flying in the Senate. But Caesar had learned early that noise does not equal threat. The loudest alarms are often the least dangerous. The real threats are invisible, bureaucratic, quiet, and he had become attuned to them. Even at night, as the city rested, or pretended to, he walked the streets, observed patterns, not marching soldiers or defeated enemies, but the rhythm of a city adjusting to new gravity. He learned to see Rome in layers, the official, the personal, the unspoken. Each layer mattered, each layer could be influenced. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rome began to accept his presence, not with enthusiasm, not with devotion, but with attention. And attention is the first step toward power. By the time the lamps burned low across the city, Julius Caesar understood that he was no longer just part of Rome, he was shaping it. Every decision, every pause, every careful smile contributed to a city that now revolved quietly around him. He had crossed rivers, survived debt, endured distant campaigns, and returned to a city that still functioned, but no longer on its own terms. The quiet rise was over. The work of influence had begun. And Rome, of course, was about to notice. Rome had settled into a peculiar rhythm. Lamps flickered at night. Tiber waters reflected moonlight. Citizens slept, half aware of the man quietly reshaping the city around them. And Julius Caesar, of course, walked among it all, attentive, deliberate, and quietly amused at how predictable human behavior could be. He wasn't loud, he wasn't theatrical, and yet every decision he made began to shift the balance of attention in his favor. Sometimes influence doesn't roar, it whispers, and Caesar had become an expert listener for that whisper. He started with small, practical measures, adjustments to grain supply, minor public works, and timing festivals to appease factions without anyone realizing they were being gently guided. People assumed these actions were random or minor, but of course they were not. Caesar understood that control often comes from invisible nudges rather than overt commands. The Senate, meanwhile, continued its careful, deliberate grumbling. Pompey was uneasy, Crassus restless. They could see Caesar's influence expanding, but they couldn't quite grasp how. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a subtle shift in attention. Citizens looked to Caesar for stability, soldiers looked to him for leadership, and even rival politicians began considering the quiet prudence of his moves. Caesar didn't need to enforce obedience, he only needed to exist strategically, and the rest followed. Meanwhile, his personal life remained a delicate balancing act. Marriages, alliances, friendships, even enemies, all became tools and indicators of influence. Caesar noticed every slight, every word, every hesitation, and he reacted subtly. A raised eyebrow, a strategic compliment, a timed withdrawal. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, just deliberate calibration of relationships. During this period, he also maintained a habit that would define him: observation. Not passive, but attentive. He could watch a market square and infer the sentiment of the city. He could listen to soldiers speaking casually by the fire and understand their morale. He could gauge the loyalty of officials by a single quiet gesture. This skill became increasingly important. As his reforms and minor adjustments began to take hold, a new unease spread among the elite. They had grown accustomed to manipulating power through spectacle and status. Caesar had shown them that subtlety and persistence could achieve results faster and more reliably than shouting or posturing. Small incidents began to reveal cracks in the old system. Senators discovered their influence waning even when they were technically still in charge. Civic leaders noticed that citizen loyalty was quietly shifting toward Caesar. Even military commanders, previously devoted to other patrons, began noticing that Caesar's judgment and consistency carried weight they hadn't anticipated. And Caesar, of course, noticed all of it. He didn't react with arrogance, he reacted with patience. A slight adjustment here, a carefully placed comment there, and the machinery of Rome slowly aligned with his direction, not through fear, not through violence, through attention, calculation, and the quiet expectation that people would eventually notice who was truly reliable. At night, the weight of observation did not ease. Lamps glimmered over quiet streets as he walked, considering not battles or laws, but human behavior. He understood the city as a living organism, its nervous system made of whispers, its pulse made of daily routines, its power centers connected by habits and loyalties rather than formal titles. By the end of this phase, Caesar had achieved something remarkable without ever drawing a sword. He had secured influence, loyalty, and momentum, not by spectacle, not by grand gestures, but through a careful, relentless awareness of the world around him. Rome was beginning to bend gently in his direction, and Caesar, as always, was calm. He knew the rise was continuing. The quiet ascent would not be interrupted by drama, at least not yet. The tension was there, of course,
Old alliances still existed, old fears still lingered, but he had learned how to navigate them, how to let his presence act while others acted themselves into mistakes. The city slept around him. The Tiber flowed, lamps flickered, and Julius Caesar moved quietly, steadily, toward a place history would later define. But for now, he only thought in steps, in observation, in timing. This is how you rise without a clash, slowly, surely, unnoticed, until the results are undeniable. And Rome, of course, would take notice eventually.
Rome was waking up to Julius Caesar. Not with fanfare, not with parades, not with sudden declarations, but with a creeping awareness. He existed everywhere, in the streets, in conversations, in votes, in subtle shifts that people only noticed when they looked back. Caesar had learned the delicate art of being unavoidable, not by force, not by shouting, but by carefully curating attention. And now that attention was starting to manifest in more obvious ways. Honors, recognitions, and the kind of popularity that makes a city whisper your name before it even hears it spoken aloud. He received titles and positions. Tribunes and officials found themselves compelled to offer deference. And yet Caesar didn't gloat. He didn't march through the city waving his hands. He remained calm, measured, a man who smiled faintly and let others assume he was modest, even when he was anything but. The streets responded differently. Ordinary Romans, who previously barely remembered the names of senators, began noticing Caesar's presence in a new way. Grain distributions arrived on time. Festivals were better organized. Infrastructure, minor but noticeable, improved steadily. Nothing extravagant, nothing that screamed authority, just consistency, attention, reliability. People trust consistency more than spectacle. Caesar understood this intuitively. Meanwhile, the Senate and elite circles began showing signs of discomfort. Some plotted subtle moves to curb his influence. Others whispered warnings, privately noting how Caesar's growing popularity might one day threaten their own ambitions. Some openly tried to align with him, hedging bets quietly, trying not to appear too eager. Caesar observed all of this with the patience of someone who had spent years learning to read power in silence. He understood gestures, micro-reactions, delayed responses. He did not react hastily. He knew that impatience is often the enemy of progress. Even as his influence expanded, he maintained personal routines. Letters, notes, observations, small acts of reflection. He walked at night, listened to the city, monitored the pulse of Rome, and recorded the behaviors of those around him. The city was alive, and he treated it as such, gently nudging, never forcing. And then there were the small tensions that are always present when someone new rises. Allies worried about loyalty, rivals worried about ambition, and ordinary citizens worried about what change would bring. Caesar did not confront these worries directly. He allowed them to exist, observed, and slowly adjusted his approach. One minor incident illustrates this well. A group of senators openly challenged one of Caesar's policies. Instead of responding in anger, Caesar quietly allowed the motion to proceed, then subtly reframed the outcome through administrative adjustments. No public confrontation, no drama. The result? The policy remained effective, the challengers looked distracted, and Caesar's presence felt steady and reliable. Popularity, after all, is not about being loved by everyone, it's about being unavoidable in the right ways. Caesar had mastered that. At night, in his private quarters, the weight of attention pressed differently. He was no longer a young man building influence from the shadows. He was visible. The city watched.
Allies and rivals alike calculated his moves. And yet he remained calm, as if the entire city's focus were merely background noise. The subtle tension continued to build. Rome had begun to adapt to Caesar's presence, but old habits die slowly. Senators debated, alliances shifted, and the balance of power quietly trembled. Caesar, as always, continued to move deliberately, step by step, observation by observation, subtle influence by subtle influence. The quiet rise continued, but Rome was now aware, and that awareness carried its own weight.
Rome had begun to recognize Julius Caesar, not in the dramatic shouting way of previous leaders, but in a steady, undeniable way. He was present in offices, in public spaces, and increasingly in the whispers of the Senate. And Rome, as always, noticed first in small increments, tiny gestures, subtle honors, celebrations that seemed ordinary but carried meaning beneath the surface. Caesar received titles, minor at first, but significant enough to signal recognition. He appeared at games, not as a showman, but as a figure whose presence mattered. Citizens noticed, soldiers noticed, senators noticed, even if they pretended not to. Influence, after all, often grows quietly, unnoticed until it's everywhere. Public celebrations became tools, intentionally or not. Grain distributions, religious festivals, minor infrastructural improvements. These were small moves, but effective. Ordinary Romans experienced them directly, and gratitude, like loyalty, is surprisingly durable. The city began associating his name with stability, competence, and subtle generosity. The elite, naturally, noticed differently. Pompey, once a celebrated general, now found himself measuring Caesar against the expectations of a populace that adored spectacle and reliability equally. Crassus, wealthy beyond imagination, realized influence could be more potent than gold. And the senators, the seasoned veterans of procedure and procedure alone, felt their control slipping, almost imperceptibly, like a tide retreating under a summer sun. Caesar's response was to remain calm, patient, almost casual. He understood that history is not won in moments of spectacle, but in the accumulation of steady, deliberate attention. Rome, as always, adapted slowly, and Caesar, as always, remained patient. The quiet rise persisted, but now beneath the surface, the early signs of rivalry, envy, and apprehension among his peers hinted that this ascent would eventually meet resistance. Rome had noticed him, and the city, for better or worse, was adjusting. Rome was no longer ignoring Julius Caesar. By now, the streets buzzed quietly with his presence. Citizens noticed the consistency. Grain delivered on schedule, festivals arranged without chaos, minor projects completed efficiently. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, but enough to build trust. Ordinary Romans began to associate Caesar's name with reliability, and reliability, as Caesar knew well, is a form of power. The elite, of course, noticed differently. They measured influence not by gratitude, but by disruption. Pompey and Crassus observed how Caesar's subtle measures were shifting public perception. Senators whispered in corridors, debating how a man with modest titles but growing visibility could quietly outmaneuver them. The very same men who once wielded authority through tradition were now contending with the force of perception. And perception in Rome is nearly as potent as law. Caesar, for his part, continued his calm, measured approach. He didn't dominate councils with speeches. He didn't flaunt influence at public events. Instead, he moved deliberately, allowing small gestures to accumulate into unmistakable presence. A well-timed remark here, a quiet intervention there. Every step calculated, yet appearing effortless. This period also saw Caesar expand his reforms, minor, practical, and subtly impactful. Administrative structures were streamlined, policies were adjusted to favor efficiency, public resources were managed with an eye toward sustainability. The changes were small enough to avoid overt backlash, yet consistent enough to shift loyalty toward him. Even the military, trained in distant campaigns and accustomed to orders from afar, began responding to Caesar's presence differently. Soldiers trusted him not because of rewards or threats, but because of consistency and clarity. Observation, he understood, builds obedience more effectively than punishment or promises. Yet with growing influence came growing tension. Senators became increasingly cautious, watching Caesar for signs of overreach. Alliances were tested. Some members of the elite attempted subtle interventions, questioning policy decisions, probing for weaknesses, or seeking to provoke errors. Caesar observed without apparent reaction. He had learned long ago that confrontation often reveals the opponent's position more than one's own. Meanwhile, the people of Rome continued their quiet acknowledgement of his presence. Public adoration wasn't loud. There were no grand parades, no chanting crowds. Just ordinary citizens noticing that life had become slightly more predictable, slightly smoother, slightly more manageable. Rome trusted Caesar not because he demanded it, but because he allowed it to form naturally. Even as his popularity increased, Caesar maintained personal discipline. Letters were written, notes kept. Observation remained constant. Walks through the city at night provided insight into the mood of citizens and officials alike. Behavior that seemed trivial, where merchants lingered, how citizens spoke in marketplaces, subtle shifts in conversation was recorded in his mind. These small details mattered. They were the foundation of influence. Yet tensions among the elite quietly escalated. Some senators attempted procedural resistance. Allies questioned loyalty. Rivals calculated timing and alliances. Caesar, calm and deliberate, adjusted without reaction. He had learned patience in distant campaigns, and it served him well in Rome's intricate social and political webs. In this quiet phase, Caesar's rise was less visible in spectacle, but more profound in consequence. Influence accumulated like sediment in a riverbed, slow, unnoticed, but reshaping the landscape inevitably. And beneath it all, the subtle unease among Rome's established leaders hinted at an eventual confrontation. The rise continued, but the shadows of envy, caution, and apprehension were growing. Rome had begun to notice him, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. And Caesar, as always, remained patient, observant, and deliberate, ready for the next phase of a long, calculated ascent.
By now, Julius Caesar had become a presence Rome could no longer ignore, not because of grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through steady, deliberate influence. The city, with all its noise and unpredictability, had begun to recognize him as a stabilizing force, someone whose attention and decisions carried weight, even when unspoken. Caesar's public image became a tool. Subtle gestures, carefully arranged appearances, and consistent reliability all contributed to an aura of inevitability. Citizens saw him at public games, distributing grain or appearing at festivals, not as a showman, but as someone whose presence mattered. Soldiers and officials noticed the quiet efficiency of his administration, the calm clarity with which he handled small crises before they became large. Influence, he knew, works best when it feels natural, almost effortless. The Senate, of course, continued to murmur.
rivalries quietly intensified. Pompey, once a celebrated general, grew uneasy as Caesar's attention to the people and to administration subtly undercut traditional authority. Crassus, wealthy beyond imagination, recognized that public influence could rival gold in its power. And the senators, long accustomed to control through procedure and precedent, felt their grip slipping, though they never admitted it aloud. Caesar's response remained calm. He did not confront openly. He did not demand acknowledgement. Instead, he allowed his actions to speak. Minor reforms, careful distribution of resources, and presence in the right places at the right times built loyalty without coercion. Every small success accumulated quietly, like water eroding stone. Tensions continued to rise among peers. Senators tested boundaries, probing for weaknesses. Allies questioned loyalty and motives. Opponents whispered, waited, and attempted to manipulate circumstances. Caesar observed each move, recording the behavior of every individual. He had learned that patience and observation often achieve more than confrontation or force. Meanwhile, public adoration grew, subtle but unmistakable. Citizens began to trust Caesar's presence, noticing that life had become slightly more predictable, slightly more stable. Festivals ran smoothly, grain was delivered reliably, administrative systems improved. People didn't cheer him loudly, but they noticed, and in Rome, notice matters as much as applause. At night, he maintained his habits. Walking the city quietly, he observed the movements of people, the mood of soldiers, the reactions of officials. Letters and notes recorded thoughts and observations. Every detail mattered. Every subtle shift contributed to his understanding of influence and loyalty. Through careful attention to the city, the military, and the political class, Caesar had turned ordinary acts of governance into tools of presence and authority. He had learned to wield influence without overt force, to shape perception without confrontation, and to guide Rome subtly while keeping himself calm and measured. And yet, beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. Established leaders felt their control slipping. Rivals grew cautious, plotting and testing boundaries. Rome had begun to recognize Caesar as inevitable, but inevitability always carries the weight of anxiety for those accustomed to traditional authority. Caesar, as always, remained patient. He did not rush, he did not panic. The rise continued, quiet, deliberate, and unassailable, and Rome, little by little, was bending toward him. By this stage, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome had become more than noticeable. It was quietly commanding, not through spectacle, shouting, or overt displays of authority, but through consistency, subtle influence, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The city was waking up to him piece by piece, action by action. He began receiving formal honors, modest at first, carefully chosen to reinforce status without provoking overt hostility. Each title, each recognition, was a signal to the citizens and the Senate alike. Caesar mattered. The public took note, soldiers observed, and peers measured their own positions in relation to him. Every award or position he accepted was deliberate. He did not overreach publicly, because Caesar understood that perception shapes reality, and subtlety often carries more weight than drama. Alongside these honors came ceremonies and public appearances, all orchestrated with quiet precision. Grain distributions continued, festivals were improved in timing and organization, and minor administrative reforms reduced inefficiencies without calling attention to themselves. Ordinary Romans experienced stability. The elite noticed influence. Caesar had learned to balance visibility and control, to shape opinion through presence rather than coercion. Of course, with influence comes tension. Senators, once confident in their authority, began to feel the subtle shift. They whispered, they questioned alliances, they tested limits. Some allies wondered about loyalty, some rivals wondered about ambition.
Caesar observed everything with his usual calm. A frown here, a hesitation there, a slightly delayed response. Every small behavior provided information. Even Pompey and Crassus, his former triumvirate partners, began to sense the change. Caesar's popularity, administrative competence, and quiet command of loyalty made old alliances delicate. Neither could dominate him as they had once expected. Both had to acknowledge privately that Caesar was no longer merely a participant in Rome's politics, he was shaping it. Caesar's personal routines remained strict. He wrote letters, maintained detailed notes, and walked the city quietly at night. He watched the streets, listened to murmurs in the forums, and observed patterns of behavior among citizens, soldiers, and officials alike. He had learned that power grows not only through decisions, but through knowledge, knowing who acts, when, and why. Small incidents revealed the depth of his influence. A minor challenge to one of his policies in the Senate failed quietly because Caesar's allies subtly adjusted the procedure. Citizens noticed improvements in public order and infrastructure, and soldiers noticed clarity in commands. The city was adapting to his presence, and the adaptation reinforced his influence without overt confrontation. Still, the tension among the elite simmered. Rome, accustomed to centuries of tradition, struggled with the quiet inevitability of Caesar's rise. Fear and envy spread discreetly among senators. They had learned, slowly, that the man who never shouted and rarely flaunted his power could quietly outmaneuver them. And Caesar remained patient, calm, observant. The rise was no longer entirely hidden. The city felt it, the Senate sensed it, and yet he moved with deliberate care, ensuring that influence accumulated steadily, imperceptibly, until it was undeniable. Rome was bending quietly toward him, step by step, decision by decision. And Caesar, as always, walked among it all, patient, attentive, and aware that the next challenges would require not force, but strategy, perception, and timing.
Rome had grown accustomed to Julius Caesar's presence, though not entirely comfortably. Citizens appreciated the stability and improvements he brought, while the Senate and elite quietly bristled at his influence. He moved carefully in this environment, aware that the most effective power is often invisible. Caesar's political maneuvers were subtle. He did not dominate councils with loud speeches, nor did he flaunt authority. Instead, he relied on timing, perception, and the careful placement of allies in key positions. Minor reforms were implemented quietly, adjusting taxation, streamlining administration, and improving public works, all of which reinforced loyalty and gave the impression of attentive governance rather than overt ambition. The public's perception was carefully managed without manipulation. Grain was distributed reliably, festivals were organized thoughtfully, and infrastructure slowly improved. Citizens did not notice grand schemes. They noticed their lives becoming slightly easier, more predictable. And in Rome, predictability builds quiet admiration. Yet even as Caesar's popularity grew, unease simmered among the elite. Senators observed every action, testing for signs of overreach. Pompey, once the celebrated general, grew cautious, calculating potential risks. Crassus, with his immense wealth, acknowledged that public favor could rival financial power. Even allies were aware that aligning with Caesar meant navigating a delicate balance between loyalty and survival. Caesar watched carefully, recording every nuance of behavior. Hesitation, subtle expressions, delayed responses, all were data points. He understood that patience often achieves more than confrontation. By allowing opponents to reveal their intentions while maintaining calm, he consolidated influence without provoking open conflict. Personal routines remained strict. He wrote letters, maintained detailed observations, and walked the city at night, listening to conversations, observing patterns, and assessing loyalty. Every detail mattered. Rome was a living organism, and Caesar had become its quiet, attentive observer. Small incidents tested his authority. Challenges arose in the Senate and among civic officials, but Caesar responded with measured adjustments rather than overt displays of power. Policies remained effective, citizens noticed stability, and soldiers adhered to his commands. Influence continued to grow, imperceptibly but inexorably. Tension among peers escalated slowly but inevitably. Rome's leaders were accustomed to authority grounded in tradition, spectacle, or wealth. Caesar demonstrated that consistency, attention, and subtle influence could shift power without dramatic gestures. The quiet unease among senators foreshadowed conflicts to come, though Caesar's patient, strategic approach allowed him to navigate these early frictions smoothly. By now, his rise was clear. Rome recognized him as indispensable, while elite peers recognized that ignoring or opposing him outright would carry risks. The city bent subtly toward his influence, and Caesar, as always, moved deliberately, observing, adjusting, and consolidating. The quiet ascent continued, now accompanied by faint but growing tremors of apprehension among those who had long dominated Rome. And Caesar, patient and attentive, understood that the next phase would require not force, but the artful management of perception, loyalty, and timing. By this point, Julius Caesar had become more than just a political figure. He was a presence, a steady, visible force that shaped the daily rhythms of Rome without demanding overt attention. Citizens noticed small improvements, soldiers observed consistency, and senators felt the subtle shifting of power, even if they pretended not to. Public perception, Caesar knew, was as critical as any law or decree. He cultivated it carefully. Grain distributions arrived predictably. Festivals were orderly yet engaging, and minor reforms improved life without seeming ambitious. Citizens didn't cheer loudly. They simply trusted that the city was functioning and that Caesar was partly responsible. Honors and formal recognition began to accumulate. Not all were grand, but each was symbolic. Titles, positions, and ceremonial acknowledgments served to reinforce the idea that Caesar mattered. The timing of each honor was deliberate, never all at once, never obvious. The quiet accumulation of recognition allowed him to consolidate authority while avoiding overt alarm. The Senate naturally felt differently. Many senators were uneasy, watching his rise with a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and fear. Pompey, once confident in his military prestige, began to notice how Caesar's public influence could rival even his own achievements. Crassus, with immense wealth, recognized that financial power alone was insufficient against growing public trust. Even allies tread carefully. Loyalty had its limits, and everyone understood that aligning with Caesar carried both advantages and potential risks. Observing these dynamics became a key part of his strategy. Hesitations, subtle expressions,
delays in response. Everything revealed intentions and helped him adjust his approach. Caesar maintained a calm, measured demeanor. He did not confront rivals directly. He did not flaunt authority. Instead, he relied on patience, observation, and incremental action. Minor challenges were addressed quietly, policy adjustments made subtly, and influence grew imperceptibly. At night, he continued his habitual walks through the city, noting patterns of behavior, citizen moods, and the flow of conversation. Letters and personal records captured every observation, every nuance. Rome, in all its complexity, was both his stage and his study. The tension within the Senate increased gradually. The traditional power structures, accustomed to control through precedent, procedure, and spectacle, found themselves challenged by Caesar's steady, strategic influence. Fear and suspicion simmered beneath polite expressions. Senators questioned each other's loyalties, considered the implications of every decision, and watched Caesar's every move. Despite this, Caesar remained calm and measured. He did not confront rivals directly. He did not flaunt authority. Instead, he relied on patience, observation, and incremental action. Minor challenges were addressed quietly, policy adjustments made subtly, and influence grew imperceptibly. The quiet rise continued, but the undercurrents of apprehension among Rome's elite hinted that open tension was approaching. Allies and rivals alike were aware that Caesar's influence could no longer be ignored. And Caesar, ever patient, continued to observe, calculate, and consolidate, preparing for the next phase of an ascent that was now visible to all, but still controlled entirely by him.
By now, Julius Caesar's influence in Rome was undeniable, though still carefully measured. Citizens had come to expect reliability and order. Soldiers respected clarity and leadership, and even the Senate could not ignore his presence without appearing inattentive or weak. Yet Caesar remained calm, deliberate, and subtly commanding, understanding that overt displays of power are rarely as effective as quiet influence. His authority was growing not through force, but through perception. Public appearances were carefully timed, honors were strategically accepted, and reforms were implemented incrementally. Grain distributions arrived predictably, festivals were thoughtfully organized, and minor improvements to infrastructure reinforced the sense of stability. Citizens did not need spectacle to notice his presence. The city itself became a reflection of his attentiveness. The Senate and political peers, however, were less comfortable. Subtle power plays were becoming more frequent. Senators whispered in corridors, questioning alliances and loyalty. Pompey's confidence showed faint cracks as he realized Caesar's growing public influence could rival his military prestige. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, acknowledged privately that financial leverage was no match for sustained public trust. Even some allies, though outwardly supportive, measured their association carefully, aware that visibility with Caesar carried both advantages and risks. Caesar observed all of this without outward reaction. Hesitations, delayed responses, fleeting expressions, all were carefully noted. He understood that patience allows others to reveal their intentions. By waiting, observing, and allowing rivalries to unfold subtly, he consolidated influence without provoking overt confrontation. The cracks in traditional alliances became evident through small incidents. Disagreements over policy,
Minor delays in correspondence or subtle shifts in voting patterns revealed tensions that had long simmered under the surface. Caesar did not confront these directly. Instead, he adjusted silently, using perception and strategic interventions to maintain loyalty and minimize disruption. Night walks through the city remained his constant practice. Observing the streets, listening to murmurs in marketplaces, and noting the behavior of officials, citizens, and soldiers, he continued to record small details in letters and notes. Every minor interaction contributed to a larger understanding of power, influence, and loyalty. Rome, while outwardly functioning as usual, was subtly changing. Citizens trusted Caesar's presence. Soldiers responded to him consistently, and the elite were increasingly conscious of his influence. Traditional power structures based on wealth, heritage, and procedure were quietly bending around him. The rise was still quiet, measured, and patient, but the early signs of friction among peers hinted that challenges would emerge eventually. Caesar had built influence carefully, guided perception, and cultivated loyalty, yet he remained aware that growth always attracts tension. And so he continued, calm, observant, patient. Each step in Rome, each minor reform, each careful gesture further consolidated authority. The city was bending toward him, and Caesar, as always, was the steady center around which this subtle transformation unfolded. By this stage, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome was not just acknowledged, it was woven into the city's daily rhythm. Citizens had come to rely on him, soldiers respected him, and even the Senate could not ignore his growing authority. Yet Caesar remained calm, deliberate, and remarkably unhurried. He understood that growth grows quietly, like water carving stone, not through forceful gestures. Public favor was consolidating. Small but consistent gestures, a grain distribution here, a festival there, minor public works improving everyday life, made citizens notice reliability more than spectacle. Visibility without overt showmanship became his tool. Rome's people trusted him because he was present in a way that felt stable, predictable, and thoughtful. The Senate, however, was increasingly uneasy. Subtle frictions had begun to surface. Pompey's confidence wavered as Caesar's influence grew. Crassus privately acknowledged the limits of wealth compared to steady public trust. And senators, traditionally accustomed to authority grounded in procedure, sensed an emerging imbalance. Alliances that once seemed secure now showed tiny cracks. Hesitations, delays, or slight disagreements in votes revealed underlying tension. Caesar, naturally, observed all of this. He recorded behaviors, noted expressions, and allowed others to reveal intentions through action or inaction. Patience, he had learned, often achieves more than confrontation. By waiting, by calibrating responses, he allowed the city and its elite to adapt gradually to his growing authority. Minor conflicts emerged, but Caesar managed them subtly. A challenge in the Senate might be allowed to play out, only to be quietly redirected later through administrative adjustments. Rivalries tested boundaries, yet Caesar did not react visibly. Instead, he consolidated loyalty, reinforced perception, and maintained calm presence. Influence accumulated, almost invisibly, while tensions simmered quietly among peers. Even his personal routines reinforced stability. Walks at night, letters, notes, and careful observation ensured that every interaction in Rome could be understood, every behavior cataloged. The city itself became a network of patterns, loyalties, and opportunities, all quietly visible to the man at its center. Through careful calculation, Caesar began preparing for future challenges. While no immediate confrontation erupted, Subtle adjustments in alliances, strategic positioning of supporters, and incremental reforms all laid the groundwork for inevitable tensions to come. Rome had adapted to his presence, but the undercurrents of apprehension among peers hinted that larger political struggles were approaching. Early cracks in alliances, subtle rivalries, and quiet rival concerns were visible to Caesar, who continued to navigate them with patience, calculation, and a calm, measured approach. The rise remained deliberate, subtle, and almost invisible to those not paying close attention. Yet every step, every minor success, every gesture ensured that Caesar's authority continued to grow steadily. The city was bending toward him, and Julius Caesar, always patient and observant, continued to consolidate influence, aware that the next phase would demand not force, but strategy, perception, and careful timing. By this point, Julius Caesar had fully established himself as a fixture in Rome. His presence was no longer optional, ignored, or fleeting. He had become a steady force, subtly influencing the rhythm of the city without the need for spectacle or intimidation. Citizens trusted his actions, soldiers followed his guidance, and even the Senate could no longer pretend that he was just another politician passing through. Honors began to accumulate, carefully calibrated to reinforce his authority without provoking open hostility. Titles, ceremonial roles, and public acknowledgments arrived in measured doses. Each recognition was small enough not to alarm anyone too quickly, yet collectively undeniable. Caesar understood that influence grows when perception of legitimacy is consistent, incremental, and visible, but never forced. Public attention, meanwhile, continued to favor him quietly. Festivals were thoughtfully organized, grain was delivered reliably, and administrative reforms improved efficiency without fanfare. Citizens experienced stability in daily life, a subtle but effective form of reassurance that reinforced their trust. Soldiers observed the clarity of his commands, and civic officials appreciated the predictable, calm guidance. Yet beneath the surface, tension among peers was growing. Pompey, whose military prestige had once secured his dominance, found himself adjusting to Caesar's steady rise. Crassus, with his wealth and ambition, recognized privately that money alone could not counter growing public favor. Senators, accustomed to authority grounded in tradition, procedure, and spectacle, sensed the subtle shift in balance and began quietly testing limits. Caesar's response remained calm and deliberate. He did not confront rivals openly, nor did he flaunt his growing authority. Instead, he observed patiently, noting hesitation, subtle expressions, and small behaviors that revealed intent. Minor challenges were allowed to surface, then carefully managed behind the scenes. By letting others reveal their positions first, he maintained control without appearing overtly aggressive.
Personal routines continued to reinforce his position. Night walks through Rome, letters, and detailed notes allowed him to monitor patterns of behavior among citizens, soldiers, and officials. Every minor interaction contributed to his understanding of loyalty, influence, and perception. The city itself had become a living map of power, and Caesar navigated it with patience and precision. Small incidents tested the stability of alliances. Slight delays, subtle disagreements, and cautious maneuvers revealed cracks in relationships that had once seemed unshakable. Caesar did not rush to exploit these cracks. He cataloged them, adjusted his strategies, and ensured that his influence remained steady. Rome had accepted him as a central figure, yet the undercurrents of fear, envy, and caution among the elite hinted at the challenges that lay ahead. Caesar's rise was no longer invisible, but the tension he created through presence, perception, and strategic patience ensured that he remained firmly in control. The quiet buildup continued. Honors accumulated. Influence spread. Alliances shifted slowly, imperceptibly, and Julius Caesar, ever calm and observant,
prepared for the inevitable confrontations with the Senate and rivals that would soon demand not just patience, but subtle, deliberate action. By now, Julius Caesar had secured a position in Rome that was as much about perception as it was about authority. Citizens noticed him in quiet ways. Grain delivered predictably, festivals arranged with care, minor infrastructure improvements that made everyday life smoother. Soldiers followed him with trust, not fear. Officials and allies observed consistency and reliability. Rome was slowly bending toward him, and he had achieved all this without dramatic displays of force. Public admiration, subtle but growing, became a powerful tool. Caesar understood that influence often comes not from spectacle, but from predictability and attentiveness. Citizens trusted him because he was present, consistent, and deliberate. The city itself reflected his calm, measured guidance. Yet the Senate and elite were increasingly uneasy. Pompey, once confident in his military authority, began to see cracks in his influence. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized that public favor could rival even his financial power. Senators accustomed to power rooted in tradition, ceremony, and procedure noticed the subtle shift in Rome's balance, and small tensions began to surface. Alliances were tested quietly, whispers multiplied, and hesitation became a common behavior. Caesar, ever patient, observed these subtle signs. Hesitation, fleeting expressions, and delayed responses were all recorded in his mind. He knew that understanding intent before acting was more effective than confrontation. Minor conflicts, procedural challenges, or discreet opposition were handled subtly through adjustments and carefully timed interventions. Influence accumulated almost invisibly, while tension simmered beneath polite facades. Personal routines remained central to his approach. Night walks through Rome allowed him to observe citizens, soldiers, and officials. Letters and notes captured every detail. The city's pulse, the rhythms of human behavior, and the shifting patterns of loyalty became a map of power that he navigated with deliberate precision. Even as admiration grew among the public, early warning signs among peers became clearer. Senators tested boundaries. Allies measured loyalty. Rivals calculated risks. Caesar did not react overtly. Instead, he allowed the early tremors of tension to reveal positions and weaknesses, preparing for the eventual political confrontations that would define the next phase of his career. Through this quiet, deliberate positioning, Caesar continued to consolidate authority. Public trust, soldier loyalty, and administrative efficiency became invisible yet unshakable pillars of his power. And Rome, while outwardly functioning as usual, was slowly adjusting to the presence of a man who had become both indispensable and inevitable. The quiet rise continued. Influence spread. Alliances shifted imperceptibly, and Julius Caesar, calm, observant, and deliberate, prepared for the next stage, where perception, timing, and strategic action would shape both his authority and the city itself.
By now, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome was more than a political fact. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Citizens began noticing patterns. Grain arriving reliably, festivals executed smoothly, minor administrative improvements that made routines simpler. Soldiers trusted his clarity and decisiveness. Civic officials, even those wary of him, came to rely on his predictability. Rome was adjusting, almost imperceptibly, to the reality of his influence. Public admiration quietly grew. Caesar had learned that attention is best earned through consistency, subtle care, and calm authority. The city trusted him not because of spectacle or loud proclamations, but because the daily life of Rome had begun to feel steadier under his presence. People noticed, subconsciously, that Caesar's decisions improved their lives, even in small ways. Reliability itself became a tool of influence. Meanwhile, unease among the Senate deepened. Pompey, once confident in his military prestige, began to see cracks in his influence. Crassus, with immense wealth, realized that public trust could rival even vast fortunes. Senators, accustomed to governing through tradition, procedure, and ceremony, began to feel the slow erosion of their authority. Whispers multiplied, alliances shifted subtly, and hesitation became a common trait among peers. Caesar responded as always, calmly, deliberately, and without overt confrontation. He allowed minor challenges to surface, observing reactions carefully. Delayed responses, fleeting expressions, subtle gestures, all were noted. Patience, he understood, was more powerful than force. By letting opponents reveal their positions and weaknesses, he consolidated influence quietly, almost invisibly, while tensions simmered beneath the polished exterior of Roman politics. Personal routines remained central to his strategy. Night walks through Rome allowed him to observe citizens, soldiers, and officials alike. Letters, notes, and detailed records preserved the subtle details of behavior, timing, and loyalty. He treated the city as a living organism, mapping patterns and anticipating how influence could spread or be challenged. The cracks in traditional alliances grew clearer. Minor disagreements, procedural delays, and cautious maneuvering revealed subtle fractures among Rome's leaders. Caesar did not rush to exploit them. Instead, he cataloged them, adjusted strategies, and ensured that his authority continued to grow steadily. By carefully expanding influence, consolidating public admiration, and allowing tension among peers to reveal itself, Caesar prepared for the next stage of his rise. He had mastered the art of subtle control. The city functioned better. Citizens trusted him, soldiers respected him, and the Senate grew increasingly aware of his quiet but undeniable power. Rome was bending toward him. Alliances were shifting imperceptibly, and Julius Caesar, calm, observant, and deliberate, readied himself for the next phase, where perception, loyalty, and timing would shape the political landscape even further. By this point, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome had become nearly inseparable from the city itself. Citizens trusted his steadiness, soldiers relied on his clarity, and officials recognized that his influence was quietly reshaping the balance of power. His rise was deliberate, invisible in its pace, yet unmistakable in effect. Caesar began to leverage subtle political maneuvering more intentionally. He placed allies in strategic positions without drawing attention, ensured that reforms and public works enhanced his reputation, and carefully guided decisions that reinforced his growing authority. These maneuvers were rarely overt. They were more like gentle nudges in a system that otherwise seemed unchanging, a quiet hand shaping perception, loyalty, and influence. Military influence, in particular, became a key asset. Soldiers respected not only his experience, but also his consistency. They noticed that orders were clear, logistics were reliable, and their well-being, even in minor matters, was considered. Loyalty, Caesar knew, is built on trust and predictability. A soldier who trusts his commander is far more valuable than one who fears him. Public admiration continued to accumulate quietly. Citizens experienced benefits in daily life, better managed grain distribution, smooth festivals, and minor improvements in administration. They didn't celebrate loudly, they simply trusted that Caesar's presence made life a little more stable. And trust in Rome is the foundation upon which real influence is built. Tension among the Senate and elite grew increasingly visible, though still subtle.
Pompey, once secure in his military prestige, began to notice how Caesar's popularity and competence could rival his own influence. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, recognized privately that public favor could outpace financial power. Senators, accustomed to authority grounded in tradition, procedure, and ceremony, began to feel the slow erosion of their control. Whispers circulated, alliances were tested, and hesitation became common among peers. Caesar responded as always, calmly, deliberately, and without overt confrontation. He allowed minor challenges to surface, observing reactions carefully. Delayed responses, fleeting expressions, subtle gestures, all were noted. Patience, he understood, was more powerful than force. By letting opponents reveal their positions and weaknesses, he consolidated influence quietly, almost invisibly, while tension simmered beneath the polished exterior of Roman politics. Personal routines remained central to his strategy. Night walks through Rome allowed him to observe citizens, soldiers, and officials alike. Letters, notes, and detailed records preserved the subtle details of behavior, timing, and loyalty. He treated the city as a living organism, mapping patterns and anticipating how influence could spread or be challenged. The cracks in traditional alliances grew clearer. Minor disagreements, procedural delays, and cautious maneuvering revealed subtle fractures among Rome's leaders. Caesar did not rush to exploit them. Instead, he cataloged them, adjusted strategies, and ensured that his authority continued to grow steadily. By carefully expanding influence, consolidating public admiration, and allowing tension among peers to reveal itself, Caesar prepared for the next stage of his rise. He had mastered the art of subtle control. The city functioned better. Citizens trusted him, soldiers respected him, and the Senate grew increasingly aware of his quiet but undeniable power. Rome was bending toward him. Alliances were shifting imperceptibly, and Julius Caesar, calm, observant, and deliberate, readied himself for the next phase, where perception, loyalty, and timing would shape the political landscape even further.
By this stage, Julius Caesar had become an unavoidable presence in Rome, not in a loud or confrontational way, but through careful attention to the rhythms of city life, loyalty of soldiers, and influence over public perception. Citizens, soldiers, and even reluctant officials had grown accustomed to his calm, steady authority, and many had begun to rely on it, almost unconsciously. Early rivalries were now starting to show themselves more clearly. The Senate, uneasy at best, began testing limits in subtle ways. Pompey, whose military reputation had once secured unchallenged dominance, started noticing how Caesar's influence over public perception and administrative efficiency could rival his own prestige. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized that money alone could not counter loyalty earned from consistency and competence. Even some of Caesar's allies moved cautiously, aware that aligning too closely with him could have risks if rivalries escalated. Despite these early tensions, Caesar's approach remained calm and measured. He did not confront openly or react emotionally. He observed. He noted hesitation, expressions, delays, and minor shifts in behavior, all of which revealed intentions and vulnerabilities. By understanding these subtleties, he continued to consolidate influence quietly, ensuring loyalty without overtly provoking his peers. The consolidation of public and military support was crucial. Soldiers respected his clarity and consistency. They trusted orders would be precise, logistics reliable, and their welfare considered, even in minor matters. Citizens noticed improvements in daily life, grain distributions arriving reliably, festivals running smoothly, and minor administrative improvements enhancing routine stability. Public trust grew quietly but steadily, reinforcing his position without spectacle or fanfare. Night walks through the city remained an essential routine. Observing citizens, soldiers, and officials provided insights into moods, behavior, and loyalty. Letters and personal notes preserved these observations. Every small detail became part of a larger map of influence, allowing Caesar to anticipate challenges and position himself strategically. Small incidents in governance and Senate debates revealed cracks in traditional alliances. Hesitations, subtle disagreements showed that peers were beginning to fear, envy, or second-guess one another. Caesar did not rush to exploit these fissures, but cataloged them, adjusted strategies, and prepared for the larger confrontations that would inevitably arise. Rome itself was changing, quietly but unmistakably. The city, its citizens, and its institutions were beginning to bend towards Caesar's influence. His rise was deliberate, patient, and carefully measured, but the growing unease among elites foreshadowed that the calm, predictable life of the city would soon encounter moments of tension and decision. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained observant, patient, and deliberate, continuing the quiet work of consolidating influence while preparing for the next stage of his ascent, where perception, loyalty, and timing would determine not just his authority, but the trajectory of Rome itself. By now, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome was fully woven into the city's daily life. Citizens trusted his consistency, soldiers relied on his clear commands, and civic officials, reluctantly or not, adapted to the rhythm of his influence. Public favor had accumulated quietly but effectively, and the subtle authority he wielded was visible to all who looked carefully. Caesar focused on strengthening alliances without fanfare. Key supporters were placed in positions of influence, often unnoticed by casual observers. Allies were cultivated not through dramatic gestures, but through trust, attention, and subtle encouragement. Those aligned with him knew that loyalty was recognized and rewarded, but not in a way that drew immediate scrutiny or provoked rivals openly. This careful cultivation ensured that his base of influence was resilient, flexible, and increasingly indispensable. Public admiration continued to grow through consistency rather than spectacle. Festivals were well organized, grain arrived on time, and minor improvements in civic administration enhanced daily life. Citizens began to see Caesar not just as a political figure, but as a stabilizing force in the city. Trust, even when quiet and understated, was forming a foundation for influence that no wealth or tradition alone could challenge. The Senate, however, remained uneasy. Traditional authority, based on procedure and precedent, struggled against Caesar's subtle rise. Pompey felt the pressure of public and military recognition shifting subtly in favor of Caesar. Crassus, aware of the limits of wealth against loyalty and competence, began adjusting his strategy. Senators whispered, tested, and hesitated, revealing cracks in the unity that had long allowed them to maintain dominance. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitations, delayed reactions, minor disagreements, they were data. He cataloged behaviors, anticipated movements, and allowed others to reveal intentions before responding. Patience remained his most powerful tool. Influence grew quietly, while tension simmered beneath the surface. Night walks through Rome, letters, and careful notes continued to form the backbone of his strategy. The city itself became a map of loyalty, behavior, and opportunity. Citizens, soldiers, and officials acted as living indicators, showing where influence was secure and where adjustments might be necessary. Minor incidents in governance and politics highlighted the increasing fragility of alliances. Hesitations,
Cautious maneuvering and subtle disagreements signaled that peers were beginning to feel the pressure of Caesar's quiet authority. Yet he did not act rashly. He allowed events to unfold, observing, adjusting, and preparing for the next stage. Rome was adapting slowly to his growing power. Citizens, soldiers, and even the Senate were bending subtly towards him, recognizing reliability, competence, and calm authority as qualities increasingly central to leadership. Caesar, ever deliberate, continued to consolidate influence, aware that the next challenges would require not force, but careful timing, perception, and strategic management of loyalty. The quiet rise continued. Influence spread, alliances strengthened, and Julius Caesar, calm, patient, and ever observant, prepared for the larger confrontations that history would remember, knowing that subtlety, consistency, and perception were the keys to power.
By this point, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome was quietly but unmistakably central. Citizens had grown accustomed to his steady hand. Grain arrived reliably, festivals ran smoothly, and minor improvements in civic administration made daily life a little easier. Soldiers followed him not out of fear, but because they trusted his consistency and competence. Even officials who were cautious or reluctant had to acknowledge his authority, if only silently. Caesar now focused on deeper consolidation of support. Strategic allies were positioned carefully within the Senate, administration, and military, ensuring loyalty without overt displays of favoritism. These allies were reinforced not with fanfare, but through trust, subtle guidance, and gentle acknowledgement. Loyalty was built on respect, predictability, and the quiet understanding that Caesar's attention rewarded reliability. Public admiration remained a quiet but powerful tool. The city trusted him not because he sought adoration, but because his actions had a tangible effect on daily life. Stability became synonymous with his presence, and even small gestures, like ensuring festivals ran smoothly or grain was delivered efficiently, reinforced the perception that Caesar was a dependable and competent leader. Reliability itself became a subtle yet potent form of influence. Tensions among peers were now growing more palpable. Pompey, whose military prestige had once guaranteed dominance, noticed how Caesar's public favor and administrative skill subtly challenged his own authority. Crassus, with immense wealth, realized that influence rooted in consistency and competence could outpace even financial power. Senators, long accustomed to governing through tradition, procedure, and ceremony, began to feel pressure and tested boundaries in discreet ways. Hesitation, whispered concerns, and subtle shifts in allegiance were now routine. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitation, minor disagreement, delayed responses, all were carefully noted. He allowed peers to reveal intentions, weaknesses, and limits without provoking confrontation. Patience, he knew, remained the most powerful tool. Influence continued to grow imperceptibly while tension simmered beneath the polite facades of Roman politics. Night walks through Rome, letters, and meticulous notes continued to form the foundation of his strategy. Observing citizens, soldiers, and officials provided insight into loyalty, patterns of behavior, and emerging tensions. Rome itself became a living map of influence, and Caesar navigated it deliberately, anticipating where adjustments would be necessary and where opportunities might arise. Cracks in traditional alliances became increasingly evident. Minor disputes, cautious maneuvers, and subtle disagreements revealed that peers were starting to feel the weight of Caesar's quiet authority. Yet he did not rush to exploit these fissures. He cataloged them, adjusted strategies, and ensured that the city's adaptation to his growing power continued smoothly. Rome was bending toward him more each day. Influence spread through public trust, military respect, and strategic alliances. The Senate felt it, citizens experienced it, and soldiers lived it. Yet the underlying tension hinted at larger confrontations ahead. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained calm, patient, and observant, understanding that the subtle accumulation of influence and the quiet management of loyalty would set the stage for the more visible, decisive moments of his career. By now, Julius Caesar's presence in Rome was firmly established. Citizens trusted the rhythm he brought to daily life. Grain arrived on time, festivals ran smoothly, and small administrative improvements made routines easier. Soldiers respected his clarity and consistency, while officials, cautious or reluctant, adapted to his growing authority. Influence had become subtle but undeniable. At this stage, Caesar focused on strategic positioning within the political landscape. Allies were quietly placed in key roles across the Senate, administrative offices, and military commands. These placements were not ostentatious or obvious, but each reinforced loyalty and ensured that his influence would ripple quietly through Rome's institutions. Public admiration continued to accumulate. Citizens associated reliability and stability with Caesar's presence, noticing not grand gestures, but small, consistent improvements. The city's well-being became a reflection of his attentiveness, and even minor successes reinforced trust. Caesar understood that influence rooted in perception and consistency often outlasts the effects of dramatic action or spectacle. The Senate's unease grew steadily. Pompey, once secure in his military prestige, now measured his moves carefully, aware that Caesar's growing popularity and competence could rival his own influence. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, privately recognized that financial power alone could not counter public trust and loyalty. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, behavior that subtly revealed cracks in the previously stable web of authority. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitation, minor disagreement, delayed responses, all were carefully noted. He allowed peers to reveal intentions, weaknesses, and limits without provoking confrontation. Patience, he knew, remained the most powerful tool. Influence continued to grow imperceptibly while tension simmered beneath the polite facades of Roman politics. Night walks through Rome, letters, and meticulous notes continued to form the foundation of his strategy. Observing citizens, soldiers, and officials provided insight into loyalty, patterns of behavior, and emerging tensions. Rome itself became a living map of influence, and Caesar navigated it deliberately, anticipating where adjustments would be necessary and where opportunities might arise. Cracks in traditional alliances became increasingly evident. Minor disputes, cautious maneuvers, and subtle disagreements revealed that peers were starting to feel the weight of Caesar's quiet authority. Yet he did not rush to exploit these fissures. He cataloged them, adjusted strategies, and ensured that the city's adaptation to his growing power continued smoothly. Rome was bending toward him more each day. Influence spread through public trust, military respect, and strategic alliances. The Senate felt it,
Citizens experienced it, and soldiers lived it. Yet the underlying tension hinted at larger confrontations ahead. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained calm, patient, and observant, understanding that the subtle accumulation of influence and the quiet management of loyalty would set the stage for the more visible, decisive moments of his career.
By now, Julius Caesar's influence over Rome was subtle but pervasive. Citizens felt the stability he brought. Grain arrived reliably, festivals ran smoothly, and minor improvements in civic administration made everyday life slightly easier. Soldiers trusted his clarity, his instructions precise and dependable, and officials, even those who were cautious or wary, had to acknowledge his growing authority. Caesar's mastery of public favor was deliberate. He understood that influence rooted in perception often outweighed displays of force. Citizens didn't need grand spectacles to appreciate him. They noticed reliability, predictability, and attention to detail. Each small improvement, timely grain deliveries, well-managed festivals, efficient administration reinforced the idea that Caesar was capable, dependable, and trustworthy. Stability itself had become a reflection of his presence. Yet behind this calm exterior, tensions among Rome's elite were escalating. Senators tested boundaries more frequently, whispered to each other, and hesitated in decisions. Pompey, whose military reputation had long commanded respect, was now careful in every move, aware that Caesar's competence and public favor could challenge his authority. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized privately that money alone could not counter loyalty earned through consistency and trust. Even some of Caesar's allies approached him with measured caution, aware that alignment with him carried both opportunities and risks. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitations, subtle expressions, and delayed responses were all catalogued. He allowed peers to reveal intentions and weaknesses first, consolidating influence quietly while tensions simmered beneath polite facades. Patience, he knew, was more powerful than confrontation. Night walks, letters, and personal notes continued to provide insight into loyalty, behavior, and sentiment across the city. Caesar treated Rome as a living, breathing organism, every citizen, soldier, and official a moving part whose actions and reactions mapped the balance of influence. By understanding these patterns, he could anticipate where adjustments or interventions would be most effective. Early moves toward confrontation were emerging, though still subtle. Minor procedural disputes in the Senate, cautious maneuvering by rivals, and small public displays of independence hinted that the calm rhythm of the city was approaching a delicate tipping point. Caesar did not force the pace. Instead, he used these signs as information, adjusting alliances, positioning loyal supporters, and consolidating influence. Rome was bending quietly toward Caesar. Public admiration grew, soldiers' loyalty strengthened, and the subtle fractures among peers became increasingly evident. The stage was being set for larger confrontations, but Caesar continued to rely on patience, perception, and the quiet management of loyalty rather than overt power plays. And through it all, he remained calm, deliberate, and observant, fully aware that the next phase of his career would require subtle action, careful timing, and strategic positioning to navigate the tensions he had so skillfully created. By this point, Julius Caesar's influence in Rome had become steady, almost natural. Citizens relied on his presence in the city's daily rhythms. Grain arrived reliably, festivals ran without a hitch, and minor administrative improvements made life subtly smoother. Soldiers continued to trust his clarity and reliability, while even cautious officials adapted to the reality of his authority. Yet beneath this calm surface, cracks in traditional alliances were becoming more visible.
Senators whispered and tested boundaries. Small disagreements and minor procedural delays hinted at tension. Pompey, long secure due to military prestige, was now careful in every move, aware that Caesar's competence and public favor could challenge his authority. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized privately that wealth alone could not counter public trust and loyalty. Even some of Caesar's allies acted with subtle caution, testing loyalties and positions. Caesar observed all of this with quiet patience. Hesitations, subtle expressions, and delayed responses were catalogued. He allowed peers to reveal intentions and weaknesses first, understanding that timing was more powerful than force. By doing nothing overtly, he consolidated influence and loyalty, while tension quietly simmered beneath the surface of Roman politics. His preparation for greater authority was deliberate. Strategic allies were positioned in the Senate, in administrative offices, and among military commands. Public perception was carefully managed, ensuring that each small act, well-timed festivals, reliable grain distribution, and improvements in infrastructure reinforced the impression of steady competence. Influence was growing quietly, but it was becoming increasingly undeniable. Night walks remained an essential part of his routine. Observing the streets, listening to murmurs in marketplaces, and noting the behavior of officials, soldiers, and citizens provided insights into loyalty, mood, and potential threats. Letters and notes preserved these observations, forming a detailed map of influence across the city. Rome, in this sense, became a living, breathing organism that Caesar understood and navigated with precision. The city itself was shifting subtly toward dependence on him. Citizens trusted his decisions without conscious recognition of the growing influence he wielded. Soldiers followed him with loyalty grounded in confidence, not fear. Senators and peers, while uneasy, were slowly adjusting to the fact that his presence shaped the rhythms of governance and civic life. Minor incidents continued to highlight vulnerabilities among allies and rivals, yet Caesar did not act impulsively. Every hesitation, every disagreement, every whisper of doubt was catalogued and allowed to inform the next step in his gradual accumulation of authority. Rome was bending toward him steadily, quietly, and almost imperceptibly. His influence now extended across public perception, military loyalty, and political networks. The stage for greater authority was being set, but Caesar remained patient, understanding that careful preparation, subtle observation, and strategic timing would determine not just his power, but the trajectory of the city itself.
By now, Julius Caesar's influence had extended into nearly every corner of Roman life. Citizens had come to rely on his steady guidance. Grain deliveries were consistent, festivals were well organized, and administrative improvements made daily life a touch smoother. Soldiers trusted his clear commands and predictable leadership, while officials, whether cautious or reluctant, found themselves adjusting to his presence. Influence was quiet but pervasive. Caesar's focus at this stage was consolidating a loyal base. Key allies in the Senate, administration, and military were carefully supported and reinforced. Loyalty was earned not through ostentatious reward, but through trust, subtle acknowledgement, and the understanding that alignment with him carried both security and opportunity. Each supporter became a reliable node in a network of influence that extended throughout Rome. Public admiration continued to grow subtly. People didn't need dramatic displays to notice his authority. They saw stability, efficiency, and consistency. Festivals ran smoothly, grain was delivered on schedule, and minor civic improvements made life more predictable. This quiet reliability reinforced the perception that Caesar was capable, thoughtful, and in control. Trust had become a powerful, almost invisible tool of influence. Meanwhile,
the Senate and political peers were adjusting to the shifting balance of power. Pompey, whose military achievements had long commanded respect, grew cautious, aware that Caesar's influence over both public opinion and administration could rival his own. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, privately recognized that financial leverage alone could not counter a reputation built on competence and trust. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, revealing subtle cracks in alliances that had long appeared stable. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitations, fleeting expressions, minor disagreements, and delays in response were carefully noted. By allowing rivals and peers to reveal their intentions first, he maintained control without overt confrontation. Patience remained his most effective tool. Influence continued to expand quietly, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Night walks, letters, and meticulous notes remained central to his practice. Observing citizens, soldiers, and officials provided insight into loyalty, sentiment, and emerging vulnerabilities. Rome had become a living, breathing system of behavior and influence that Caesar could read and navigate with precision. Minor incidents, small disagreements, cautious maneuvers, and hesitations continued to highlight vulnerabilities among allies and rivals alike. Yet Caesar did not rush to exploit them. Instead, he cataloged these moments, adjusted strategies subtly, and ensured that his influence remained solid while the city adapted gradually to his growing authority. Rome was bending quietly toward him. Influence spread through public trust, military loyalty, and a web of alliances carefully nurtured over time. Senators and peers sensed the shift, citizens experienced it, and soldiers lived it daily. The calm rhythms of the city had been altered subtly, preparing the ground for future confrontations without abrupt disruption. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained patient, deliberate, and observant, knowing that the careful accumulation of loyalty, perception, and influence would shape the more visible and decisive moments of his career. By this stage, Julius Caesar's influence over Rome was both deep and wide. Citizens trusted the rhythm he provided. Grain arrived on schedule, festivals ran smoothly, and minor administrative improvements made life subtly more manageable. Soldiers relied on his clarity, predictability, and attention to their welfare. Even the most cautious officials had adjusted to his presence, quietly acknowledging that his authority shaped the city's functioning. Caesar's focus now was on near-complete consolidation of his influence. Strategic allies were positioned carefully in the Senate, administration, and military, forming a network of loyalty that extended across the city. These supporters were cultivated through subtle acknowledgement, trust, and the understanding that their alignment with him carried opportunity, stability, and protection. The web of influence was almost seamless, making Caesar's authority difficult to challenge without risking one's own position. Public admiration remained a quiet but powerful force. Citizens didn't need grand gestures. They noticed consistent improvements in their daily lives. Festivals ran without issues, grain was reliably delivered, and civic administration functioned efficiently. Trust, perception, and reliability had become key instruments of power, quietly reinforcing his authority in ways that money or spectacle alone could not. The Senate, increasingly aware of the shifting balance of power, was growing uneasy. Pompey, whose military prestige had long commanded respect, now carefully measured his moves, understanding that Caesar's combination of public favor, military respect, and political influence presented a real challenge. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, privately recognized that financial leverage alone could not counter a reputation built on competence and trust. Senators whispered,
tested boundaries, and hesitated, revealing subtle cracks in alliances that had long appeared stable. Caesar observed all of this calmly. Hesitations, fleeting expressions, minor disagreements, and delays in response were carefully noted. By allowing rivals and peers to reveal their intentions first, he maintained control without overt confrontation. Patience remained his most effective tool. Influence continued to expand quietly, even as tension simmered beneath the surface. Night walks, letters, and meticulous observation remained central to his practice. Observing citizens, soldiers, and officials provided insight into loyalty, sentiment, and emerging vulnerabilities. Rome had become a living, breathing system of behavior and influence that Caesar could read and navigate with precision. Minor incidents, small disagreements, cautious maneuvers, and hesitations continued to highlight vulnerabilities among allies and rivals alike. Yet Caesar did not rush to exploit them. Instead, he cataloged these moments, adjusted strategies subtly, and ensured that his influence remained solid while the city adapted gradually to his growing authority. Rome was bending quietly toward him. Influence spread through public trust, military loyalty, and a web of alliances carefully nurtured over time. Senators and peers sensed the shift, citizens experienced it, and soldiers lived it daily. The calm rhythms of the city had been altered subtly, preparing the ground for future confrontations without abrupt disruption. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained patient, deliberate, and observant, knowing that the careful accumulation of loyalty, perception, and influence would shape the more visible and decisive moments of his career.
By now, Julius Caesar's influence in Rome had reached a nearly undeniable level. Citizens had grown accustomed to the rhythm he brought. Grain deliveries were reliable, festivals ran smoothly, and administrative improvements made life subtly easier. Soldiers trusted his clarity, predictability, and attention to their well-being. Even the most cautious officials had adjusted to the reality of his authority, quietly recognizing his growing importance. The city itself seemed to bend toward him. Public admiration, grounded in reliability rather than spectacle, had become a quiet yet powerful pillar of influence. Citizens felt stability in their routines, associating it unconsciously with Caesar's presence. Each well-managed festival, grain delivery, and civic improvement reinforced the perception that he was competent, thoughtful, and calm, a leader whose touch made life orderly and predictable. Meanwhile, the Senate and peers were sensing the tipping point. Pompey, long secure due to his military prestige, measured every move cautiously, aware that Caesar's growing influence in both public opinion and political affairs could rival his own. Crassus recognized privately that wealth alone could not counter loyalty earned through consistent leadership and trust. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, subtly revealing fractures in alliances that had long appeared stable. Caesar observed all of this quietly. Hesitations, minor disagreements, and delayed responses were cataloged as valuable data. He allowed others to reveal their intentions first, consolidating influence without overt confrontation. Patience remained his most effective tool. The city adapted to his authority almost invisibly, while tension quietly intensified. Night walks, letters, and careful observation continued to provide a window into loyalty, sentiment, and the behavior of citizens, soldiers, and officials. Rome became a living map, a network of relationships and opportunities that Caesar navigated with precision. Every small gesture, hesitation, or comment was an insight into the evolving balance of power.
Minor incidents in governance, subtle manipulations of public opinion, and cautious maneuvers by rivals highlighted the fragility of traditional alliances. Caesar did not rush to exploit these fissures. Instead, he adjusted strategies and prepared for the inevitable political confrontations, ensuring that the city's adaptation to his authority remained smooth. Rome was quietly aware of the shift. Citizens experienced stability, soldiers experienced clear leadership, and senators and peers increasingly recognized Caesar as a force that could not be ignored. Minor incidents highlighted vulnerabilities among rivals, but Caesar did not rush to exploit them. Instead, he adjusted strategies, strengthened loyalty, and positioned himself for larger, inevitable confrontations. The early signs of confrontation were subtle yet unmistakable. Rivalries grew sharper, tensions simmered in the Senate, and small maneuvers hinted at coming power struggles. Yet Caesar remained patient, observing, noting, and preparing. The city had adapted to his influence, but the stage was now set for visible, decisive moments. Rome was quietly acknowledging a new reality. Julius Caesar's authority was near its peak, subtly entrenched across public perception, military loyalty, and political influence. And through it all, he maintained his calm, deliberate demeanor, knowing that the careful, patient accumulation of influence had positioned him perfectly for the pivotal events that would soon shape the future of Rome.
By this point, Julius Caesar's influence in Rome had reached a nearly undeniable height. Citizens relied on his presence, grain arrived reliably, festivals proceeded smoothly, and minor administrative improvements made everyday life more predictable. Soldiers trusted him implicitly, not out of fear, but because his clarity, consistency, and attention to their welfare made him dependable. Even the most cautious officials had adjusted to his authority, quietly recognizing that his decisions now shaped the rhythms of the city. Caesar's rise was now fully consolidated. Strategic allies, carefully positioned in the Senate, military, and administration, formed a network of loyalty and influence that extended across Rome. Public admiration reinforced his authority. Citizens associated stability, competence, and reliability with him. Every small act, from efficient governance to well-managed civic events, strengthened the perception that Caesar was calm, capable, and deserving of trust. Tension among peers had escalated quietly but noticeably. Pompey, whose military reputation had long secured his dominance, now moved with caution, aware that Caesar's growing popularity and influence could rival his authority. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized that financial power alone could not compete with trust earned through competence and consistency. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, revealing fractures in alliances that had once seemed stable. Yet Caesar remained calm and deliberate. Hesitations, minor disagreements, and subtle gestures were cataloged, analyzed, and used to anticipate future moves. By allowing rivals to reveal intentions first, he maintained control without overt confrontation. Patience, as always, proved more powerful than direct force. Influence spread quietly, while tension continued to simmer just below the surface. Night walks, letters, and careful observation remained essential. Caesar read Rome as a living map. Citizens, soldiers, and officials acted as indicators, revealing loyalty, sentiment, and emerging vulnerabilities. Every small behavior informed strategy, allowing him to maintain near-complete control over both public perception and the political landscape. The city had subtly shifted toward dependence on his authority. Citizens trusted the stability he provided, soldiers followed his guidance with trust rather than fear, and officials, even the most cautious, adjusted their actions to fit the new rhythms dictated by his presence. Minor incidents continued to reveal cracks among rivals, yet Caesar did not act hastily. Instead, he adjusted strategies, reinforced loyalty, and ensured that Rome's adaptation to his authority remained smooth. Now, on the cusp of visible turning points, Rome stood quietly aware of a new reality. Julius Caesar's near-complete rise had subtly but unmistakably transformed the city. Public trust, military loyalty, and political influence had converged, creating a foundation for decisive events that would soon reshape the course of Roman history. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained patient, deliberate, and observant, ready for the moment when quiet influence would meet visible action and the next chapter of Rome's story would unfold. As Julius Caesar's influence settled over Rome, the city moved with a quiet awareness of change. Citizens had grown used to reliable grain deliveries, well-managed festivals, and the subtle improvements that made daily life smoother. Soldiers followed his guidance with trust rather than fear, and officials, even the most cautious, adjusted their actions to fit the new rhythms dictated by his presence. By now, Caesar's authority was nearly complete, though still exercised with calm precision. Allies were strategically positioned across the Senate, military, and administrative offices, forming a resilient network of support. Public admiration, grounded in the perception of competence and reliability, had become a subtle but powerful pillar of influence. Stability and order were associated with his presence, reinforcing trust across every layer of Roman life. Tension among the elite was palpable, though contained. Pompey, whose military reputation had long secured his dominance, now moved with caution, aware that Caesar's growing popularity and influence could rival his authority. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized that financial power alone could not compete with trust earned through competence and consistency. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, revealing fractures in alliances that had once seemed stable. Yet Caesar remained calm and deliberate. Hesitations, minor disagreements, and subtle gestures were catalogued, analyzed, and used to anticipate future moves. By allowing rivals to reveal intentions first, he maintained control without overt confrontation. Patience, as always, proved more powerful than direct force. Influence spread quietly, while tension continued to simmer just below the surface. Night walks, letters, and careful observation remained essential. Caesar read Rome as a living map. Citizens, soldiers, and officials acted as indicators, revealing loyalty, sentiment, and emerging vulnerabilities. Every small behavior informed strategy, allowing him to maintain near-complete control over both public perception and the political landscape. The city had subtly shifted toward dependence on his authority. Citizens trusted the stability he provided, soldiers followed his guidance with confidence, and officials, even the most cautious, adjusted their actions to fit the new rhythms dictated by his presence. Minor incidents continued to reveal cracks among rivals, yet Caesar did not act hastily. Instead, he adjusted strategies, reinforced loyalty, and ensured that Rome's adaptation to his authority remained smooth. Now, on the cusp of visible turning points, Rome stood quietly aware of a new reality. Julius Caesar's near-complete rise had subtly but unmistakably transformed the city. Public trust, military loyalty, and political influence had converged,
creating a foundation for decisive events that would soon reshape the course of Roman history. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained patient, deliberate, and observant, ready for the moment when quiet influence would meet visible action and the next chapter of Rome's story would unfold. As Julius Caesar's influence settled over Rome, the city moved with a quiet awareness of change. Citizens had grown used to reliable grain deliveries, well-managed festivals, and the subtle improvements that made daily life smoother. Soldiers followed his guidance with trust rather than fear, and officials, even the most cautious, adjusted their actions to fit the new rhythms dictated by his presence. By now, Caesar's authority was nearly complete, though still exercised with calm precision. Allies were strategically positioned across the Senate, military, and administrative offices, forming a resilient network of support. Public admiration grounded in the perception of competence and reliability had become a subtle but powerful pillar of influence. Stability and order were associated with his presence, reinforcing trust across every layer of Roman life. Tension among the elite was palpable, though contained. Pompey, whose military reputation had long secured his dominance, now moved with caution, aware that Caesar's growing popularity and influence could rival his authority. Crassus, wealthy and ambitious, realized that financial power alone could not compete with trust earned through competence and consistency. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, signaling the cracks in alliances that had once seemed stable. Yet Caesar remained calm and deliberate. Hesitations, minor disagreements, and subtle gestures were catalogued, analyzed, and used to anticipate future moves. By allowing rivals to reveal intentions first, he maintained control without overt confrontation. Patience, as always, proved more powerful than direct force. Influence spread quietly, while tension continued to simmer just below the surface. Night walks, letters, and careful observation remained essential. Caesar read Rome as a living map. Citizens, soldiers, and officials acted as indicators, revealing loyalty, sentiment,
And emerging vulnerabilities. Every small behavior informed strategy, allowing him to maintain near complete control over both public perception and the political landscape. The city had subtly shifted toward dependence on his authority. Citizens trusted the stability he provided. Soldiers followed his orders with confidence, and the Senate recognized, however reluctantly, that his influence was unavoidable. Minor incidents continued to reveal cracks among rivals, yet Caesar did not act hastily. Instead, he adjusted strategies, reinforced loyalty, and ensured that Rome's adaptation to his authority remained smooth. Now, on the cusp of visible turning points, Rome stood quietly aware of a new reality. Julius Caesar's near-complete rise had subtly but unmistakably transformed the city. Public trust, military loyalty, and political influence had converged, creating a foundation for decisive events that would soon reshape the course of Roman history. And through it all, Julius Caesar remained patient, deliberate, and observant, ready for the moment when quiet influence would meet visible action, and the next chapter of Rome's story would unfold. As Julius Caesar's influence settled over Rome, the city moved with a quiet awareness of change. Citizens had grown used to reliable grain deliveries, well-managed festivals, and the subtle improvements that made daily life smoother. Soldiers followed his guidance with trust rather than fear, and officials, even the most cautious, adjusted their actions to fit the new rhythms dictated by his presence. By now, Caesar's authority was nearly complete, though still exercised with calm precision. Allies were strategically positioned across the Senate, military, and administrative offices, forming a resilient network of support. Public admiration, grounded in the perception of competence and reliability, had become a subtle but powerful pillar of influence. Stability and order were associated with his presence, reinforcing trust across every layer of Roman life. Tension among the elite was palpable, though contained. Pompey, once confident in his unmatched military prestige, now moved with caution, aware that Caesar's growing influence could rival his own authority. Crassus realized privately that wealth alone could not counter public loyalty and perception. Senators whispered, tested boundaries, and hesitated, signaling the cracks in alliances that had long seemed unbreakable. Caesar remained observant, patient, and deliberate. Every hesitation, minor disagreement, or subtle gesture revealed valuable insight. By allowing rivals to reveal their intentions first, he could act strategically, maintaining control without overt confrontation. Patience had proven time and again to be more effective than force, and influence continued to accumulate almost invisibly. Night walks, letters, and careful observation of citizens, soldiers, and officials continued to inform his understanding of Rome as a living, breathing system. Every behavior, every fleeting expression, every whisper became data for anticipating opportunities, mitigating risks, and reinforcing loyalty. Rome itself had become a map of power, and Caesar navigated it with precision. The city, while calm on the surface, was now subtly aware of the approaching turning points. Citizens relied on stability, soldiers relied on leadership, and the Senate felt the quiet pressure of an authority that could no longer be ignored. Minor incidents revealed weaknesses and hesitation among peers, but Caesar did not act impulsively. He allowed the tension to build, knowing that timing would determine the next chapter. Rome had adapted quietly to his influence. Public trust, soldier loyalty, and political sway had converged to create a foundation for the pivotal moments that would soon shape history. Julius Caesar's near-complete rise was now poised at the edge of visible change, a calm before the decisive events that would define his legacy. And through it all, he remained calm, deliberate, and observant, fully prepared to transition from quiet influence to the next stage where perception, strategy, and action would converge, setting the city on a path that few could yet imagine.